Forget exotic poisons or high stakes. Hey there, welcome back. Today we are unpacking the strangest times breakfast, lunch, and dinner took people out in ways you have to hear to believe.
From a woman taken out by a freak steak sneeze to a man whose favorite movie ended with a single popcorn kernel lodged in exactly the wrong place. It was May 15th, 2015. A retirement luncheon at an elementary school in Kansas had just wrapped up. Folding tables still held a few trays of food, half-empty coffee cups, and slices of sheet cake. A handful of teachers stood near the cafeteria doors, finishing lunch while waiting for rides home. It was the kind of ordinary afternoon that usually passes, without anyone remembering much about it. Caroline Carol Denning was 41 and had been a school principal for 6 years. Co-workers said she was usually the last one to leave, making sure everyone else was taken care of first. Her younger sister later told investigators that Carol had lived with a sunlight-triggered sneezing reflex since childhood, and the family treated it as nothing more than one of her little quirks. Since childhood, Carol had lived with a condition called the photic sneeze reflex. Bright sunlight could trigger an immediate sneeze whenever she stepped outside. It wasn't a medical problem that affected her daily life. In fact, everyone at school knew about it.
I actually think that's the kind of nickname every workplace has, something harmless that eventually becomes part of who you are.
The luncheon was for Dot, the cafeteria worker who had spent decades serving students. Before leaving, Carol packed 3 foil containers with leftover steak, potatoes, and green beans, so the food wouldn't go to waste. With both hands full, she took one last bite of steak while standing near the exit, planning to finish chewing on the walk to her car. It wasn't unusual. Several co-workers later told investigators they had seen people do the same thing many times. Carol pushed open the doors and stepped into the afternoon sun. Just behind her were 2 teachers, still talking as they walked outside together. As soon as the sunlight hit Carol's face, she sneezed, hard enough that the food containers slipped from her hands and hit the sidewalk. At first, they thought Carol had simply stumbled after sneezing, but Carol stayed on her knees with one hand at her throat and wasn't able to speak. One teacher immediately called emergency services while the other began abdominal thrusts because she had completed the district's CPR and first aid training. I think this is the point where everyone around her realized this wasn't an ordinary choking episode. The nurse arrived with an AED, but the problem wasn't Carol's heart. It was the piece of steak completely blocking her airway. Paramedics arrived after the emergency call. They tried to remove the obstruction using specialized equipment, but the steak had lodged too deeply to be reached safely at the scene. Carol went into cardiac arrest during the ambulance ride and was pronounced dead shortly afterward. The medical examiner ruled her death an accidental choking. According to the report, the force of the sneeze pulled the partially chewed steak into her windpipe as she inhaled, creating a complete blockage. The report found no underlying medical condition that contributed to her death besides the lifelong sunlight-triggered sneeze reflex. The retirement luncheon was canceled for the rest of the afternoon as teachers, staff, and students were sent home early. A memorial service was held the following week, with hundreds of former students, parents, and staff attending. In the months that followed, the district added choking response refresher training to its annual first aid program. I think that's how many tragedies are remembered. Not by changing everything, but by changing one small habit that people rarely thought about before.
I've never really thought about walking outside while I was still chewing my food. Carol's case has made me realize how something you've done hundreds of times can suddenly go wrong. But the next story starts with something even harder to question. A homemade loaf of bread from a neighbor who was simply trying to say thank you.
It was February 11th, 2014 in West Virginia. Snow from a storm earlier that week still covered the sides of neighborhood streets. Most people had already left for work, and apartment parking lots were beginning to empty for the day. Roger Absalom was 53 and had worked maintenance at the apartment complex for nearly 12 years. Tenants knew him as the person who fixed leaking faucets, replaced broken locks, and shoveled sidewalks before most people were awake. Since December, He had also cleared the sidewalk of an elderly neighbor every time it snowed without asking for anything in return. For the previous 8 months, Roger had also been caring for his wife, Alicia, after she suffered a stroke. He arranged his work around her therapy appointments and cooked nearly every meal at home. Money was tight on one income, and Roger had grown up in a family where food wasn't thrown away unless it was obviously unsafe. That habit stayed with him throughout his life. One Tuesday morning, the neighbor thanked Roger by giving him 2 homemade loaves of rye bread wrapped in a dish towel. She had milled the rye herself from grain that had been stored in an old barn after a damp fall season.
The bread carried a suspicious sour tang, the kind that should have set off every alarm bell in his head. Yet, according to witnesses, he rationalized it was just homemade and dug in.
Roger polished off 2 slices with dinner and was already back for more with his morning coffee. By early afternoon, Roger noticed tingling in his fingers while repairing a leaking faucet in another apartment. He mentioned to Alicia that his hands felt strange and said it was probably from working in the cold. About 2 hours later, the tingling spread into his arms. A tenant later told investigators that Roger kept looking over his shoulder in the hallway and brushing at his sleeves as if something was crawling on them, even though nothing was there. Alicia followed him toward the front entrance, but she couldn't keep up because she was still recovering from her stroke. Roger went outside and started running down the road. 2 women talking on a front porch across the street saw him sprint past, shouting that someone was chasing him. They looked up and saw that there was nobody behind him. At the intersection, Roger ran into traffic without slowing down. A minivan swerved and avoided him. The driver of a sedan didn't have enough time to stop. The impact threw Roger onto the hood before he landed on the pavement several feet away. One of the women who had seen him running called emergency services, while the sedan's driver stayed beside Roger until paramedics arrived about 11 minutes later. Several witnesses later told police that Roger continued saying someone was after him, even though the street around him was clear. Roger was taken to the hospital, where he died about 4 hours later from his injuries. The medical examiner found ergot alkaloids in Roger's blood. These toxins are produced by a fungus that can grow on damp rye grain if it's stored under poor conditions.
Doctors concluded the poisoning caused severe confusion and hallucinations that led Roger to run into traffic.
The fatal injuries themselves came from being struck by the vehicle. I think this is one of the hardest stories in the episode because nothing about the bread looked dangerous. Investigators traced the rye back to grain that had been stored in a damp barn where fungal growth had gone unnoticed. The neighbor who gave Roger the bread was not charged because there was no evidence she knew the grain was contaminated, but health officials told her to discard the remaining flour and bread immediately. She later cooperated with testing and stopped milling her own grain. Alicia continued living in the apartment after Roger's death. Several months later, she worked with a local food bank and county health staff to create a short guide about safe grain storage and the risks of using rye that had been exposed to moisture. Roger's case is strange because nothing about that bread looked spoiled. The danger was there long before it reached his kitchen. The next story is different. This time, the food wasn't contaminated at all. It was something millions of people eat every single summer. It was July 9th, 2016 in Illinois. A backyard was busy with a child's birthday party. Kids were running between the swing set and the picnic table while parents talked under a pop-up canopy. A sprinkler clicked across the lawn and someone was setting out bowls of ice cream next to the birthday cake. Among the guests was Jonessa Okafor, 38. She had worked at the front desk of a local emergency room for 11 years. She wasn't a nurse or a doctor, but she checked in hundreds of patients every week and recognized the warning signs of strokes, heart attacks, and other emergencies. Co-workers often asked her to help calm nervous patients because she knew exactly what questions to ask while medical staff were on their way. Away from work, Jonessa was known for always finishing her ice cream before everyone else. It became a running joke at family gatherings and office parties, and one coworker even gave her a small plastic trophy made from a painted spoon. She also dealt with occasional migraines, but they usually went away after some rest and over-the-counter medicine. It's funny how little family jokes end up becoming details people never forget. The birthday cake was ready, but the candles had already started softening in the afternoon heat. Jonessa helped serve bowls of vanilla and chocolate ice cream to the children before scooping one for herself. She stayed in the kitchen, eating quickly while standing at the counter so she could get back outside before everyone gathered for pictures. Her sister, Angela, was only a few feet away washing serving bowls when Jonessa suddenly stopped eating and rested one hand on the counter. Jonessa said the pain behind her left eye was much worse than a normal brain freeze. Angela handed her a paper towel, and Jonessa said it would probably pass in a minute.
Honestly, I think most of us would have said the same thing. Brain freeze isn't something people usually worry about.
Instead, the pain continued. Within a couple of minutes, Angela noticed Jonessa's speech becoming slightly slurred. Jonessa reached for her spoon, but missed the edge of the counter. At almost the same time, Angela's daughter was recording everyone getting ready for the birthday song. Jonessa appeared briefly in the background, leaning against the sink and speaking, but nobody watching the party paid much attention because everyone was focused on the cake. About 10 minutes later, Jonessa tried picking up a stack of paper plates with her right hand but couldn't keep hold of them. She told Angela her right arm felt numb. Angela asked if she wanted to sit down, and Jonessa walked to a kitchen chair while another family member brought her a glass of water. Over the next several minutes, more relatives noticed that one side of her face had started to droop and that her words were becoming harder to understand. Angela called 911 immediately. Paramedics arrived about 12 minutes later and took Jonessa to the same emergency room where she worked. A CT scan showed she had suffered a severe stroke. Despite treatment, Jonessa remained in the neurological intensive care unit for 2 days, but repeated brain scans showed extensive damage from the stroke. After consulting with her family, doctors determined there was no meaningful chance of recovery, and she died on July 11th. The medical examiner ruled her death an ischemic stroke.
The report concluded that in an extremely rare event, the sudden exposure to very cold food likely triggered severe narrowing of blood vessels supplying her brain, reducing blood flow long enough to cause the stroke.
Specialists noted that brain freeze is harmless for almost everyone, and that cases like Jonessa's are exceptionally uncommon. Her co-workers at the emergency department later organized a blood drive in her memory, and several staff members said the case changed the way they responded to patients who reported sudden neurological symptoms, even when they initially sounded minor. What surprises me about Jonessa's story is how easy it was to mistake something serious for something harmless. Warren's case is almost the opposite. There weren't any warning signs that pointed to candy until doctors started putting the pieces together afterward. It was March 23rd, 2017. The overnight toll plaza outside Sarasota was quiet. Traffic had slowed to just a few cars every several minutes. The air smelled like damp pavement after an evening shower, and the only steady noise came from the booth air conditioner and a vending machine near the break room. Working that shift was Warren Dale Tibbetts, who was 61. He had spent 11 years on the overnight crew, first as a toll collector and later running the booth by himself after most lanes became automated. He preferred the night shift because it was predictable. Drivers stopped for a few seconds, paid their toll, and kept moving. 2 years earlier, his doctor told him to quit smoking because of his blood pressure. Instead, Warren started chewing black licorice twists every night, and before long, it had become part of his routine. Warren kept a handwritten logbook during every shift, even though the computer already recorded each transaction. He also ate nearly 2 bags of black licorice every night, something he had been doing for more than a year.
He took medication for high blood pressure every morning and rarely missed a dose. To almost anyone looking at him, it just looked like an ordinary candy habit.
A few weeks before the accident, Warren started mentioning cramps in his legs and feeling more tired than usual. One night, another booth operator saw him stretching beside the lane and asked if he was all right. The investigation report stated that Warren brushed it off and said the overnight hours were finally catching up with him. It's easy to ignore those small changes. We naturally look past the little warning signs because they don't seem like a big deal when they happen to ordinary things. Just after 3 o'clock that morning, traffic became even lighter. Warren finished logging a few vehicles, wrote the totals in his notebook, and reached into the open bag of licorice beside the register. A maintenance worker driving through the toll lane waved as he passed. Warren waved back before scanning the next vehicle. Warren then finished collecting a toll from a pickup truck. The driver later told investigators that Warren looked normal during the transaction. Seconds later, another maintenance employee walked toward the booth to ask about a lane closure scheduled for later that morning. Before he reached the window, he saw Warren grab the edge of the counter, stumble backward, and disappear from view. The worker called Warren's name, but got no response. He found Warren lying behind the counter and radioed the supervisor while another employee called emergency services. Paramedics arrived about 9 minutes later and began CPR, but Warren never regained a pulse. The medical examiner found Warren's potassium level had dropped dangerously low. The cause was glyceric acid, a natural compound in real black licorice that can cause the body to lose potassium when eaten in large amounts over time, increasing the risk of a fatal heart rhythm. Investigators also noted that his blood pressure medication likely made that risk even greater. Warren's death initially surprised both his family and coworkers because there were no signs of trauma or poisoning at the scene. It wasn't until toxicology testing and a review of his medical history that doctors connected the fatal heart rhythm to his long-term licorice consumption. His daughter later said, "The explanation was something the family had never imagined."
That's what stayed with me about this case. It took a medical investigation to reveal that the habit everyone thought was harmless had been causing damage for months.
When people think about dangerous foods, candy usually isn't on the list. But the next case proves that sometimes it isn't the food that's dangerous at all, it's the harmless habit that comes with it. It was March 5th, 2018. A karaoke bar in Michigan was packed for a Friday night. Music echoed through the room. Servers weaved between crowded tables carrying drinks and baskets of appetizers, and colored glow sticks lit up the stage while customers waited for their turn to sing. Tobias Renner was 35 and rarely missed karaoke night with the same group of college friends. During the week, he worked as an accountant, the kind of person who checked every detail twice before signing off on anything. A few weeks earlier, he had finished 6 rounds of chemotherapy. His doctors had finally cleared him to resume normal activities, so this Friday felt like a small victory. After months of hospitals and treatment, he was finally getting his old life back. The group had a tradition before every performance. Whoever was about to sing had to take a sip of the house's signature cocktail before walking on stage. The drinks came decorated with small novelty glow sticks that clipped onto the straws. And over the years, people had started joking around with them, pretending they were microphones or fake cigarettes while waiting for their songs. That night, Tobias picked up his drink just as his name appeared on the karaoke screen. Laughing with his friends, he pulled a small plastic glow stick off the straw and jokingly held it between his teeth while making his way toward the stage. I don't think anyone at that table gave it a second thought. It was exactly the kind of harmless thing people do without even realizing they're doing it. Security footage later showed Tobias laughing just before he reached the microphone. At that moment, he accidentally inhaled, drawing the small plastic glow stick into the back of his throat. It lodged deep inside his airway, blocking it almost completely. He immediately grabbed his throat and the audience barely reacted. The song he had chosen opened with a long instrumental intro, so everyone assumed he was waiting for the vocals to begin. A few people even applauded, believing he was building suspense before the first line. Instead of singing, Tobias staggered sideways and tried desperately to cough, but almost no sound came out.
Looking back, that's the part I can't stop thinking about. Dozens of people were watching him, but almost everyone believed it was part of the performance.
Bartender Melissa Haynes was the first to realize something was wrong. She noticed Tobias wasn't reaching for the microphone or acknowledging the crowd. His face was turning dark, and he kept clawing at his throat. She rushed onto the stage and immediately performed abdominal thrusts while his friends called emergency services, but the plastic glow stick remained firmly lodged inside Tobias's airway. Staff cleared the area while someone retrieved the restaurant's first aid kit. Paramedics arrived about 9 minutes after the emergency call. They used specialized airway equipment to remove the obstruction and immediately began advanced life support before transporting Tobias to the nearest trauma center. Despite their efforts, he had been without enough oxygen for too long. He was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at the hospital. The medical examiner determined that Tobias died from complete airway obstruction caused by aspiration of the small plastic glow stick. The report also confirmed that his recent chemotherapy played no role in his death. Investigators concluded that the delayed response occurred because witnesses genuinely believed his silence and movements were part of the karaoke performance rather than signs of a medical emergency. After the incident, the karaoke lounge stopped using removable glow stick drink decorations. Bartender Melissa Haynes was recognized by the lounge for her quick response during the emergency, even though Tobias could not be saved. Tobias's friends also ended the pre-performance drinking tradition that had become part of every Friday night. The whole thing seemed unbelievably ordinary. A tiny party decoration, a joke that lasted only a few seconds, and a room full of people who thought they were watching someone entertain them instead of fighting for his life.
Now, the next victim didn't even have a crowd around him, just a movie, a bowl of popcorn, and a routine he'd done before.
It was October 14th, 2021, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The apartment complex was settling down for the night. A few porch lights were still on, and a maintenance worker was replacing a hallway light while two neighbors talked outside before heading in. Most of the televisions had already replaced the usual evening conversations. Walter Grunwald was 58 and had retired the previous spring after spending 22 years as a claims adjuster. He lived alone and kept a routine that rarely changed. Bills were filed in labeled folders, grocery lists stayed clipped to the refrigerator, and he drove the same sedan he'd owned for over a decade. Investigators later noted that very little in the apartment appeared to have changed since his wife, Sandra, died 11 months earlier. Clothes still hung in her closet, and many of her belongings remained exactly where she had left them. The television and smart speaker in the living room had been Sandra's idea. She liked playing music while cooking and watching old comedies on weeknights. Walter never changed any of the settings after she died. His daughter later told investigators that even the stack of DVDs beside the television had stayed untouched for almost a year. That Monday would have marked their 31st wedding anniversary. Walter made popcorn just like Sandra always had, extra butter and no salt, and put on one of the comedies they used to watch together. I think a lot of people have little routines like that. After losing someone, he started the movie a little after 8 o'clock. About 20 minutes into the film, Walter laughed and reached for another handful of popcorn. One kernel hadn't fully popped. As he laughed and inhaled, the hard kernel entered his airway instead of going down his esophagus.
Based on the evidence reconstruction, he stood up immediately, dropped the bowl onto the floor, and reached for his phone, calling emergency services.
The call was connected, but Walter couldn't speak. Dispatchers could hear movement and strained breathing, but no words before the line suddenly went silent. Officers were dispatched to Walter's apartment, but after receiving no response at the door and finding no obvious signs of an emergency, they were unable to enter and eventually cleared the scene. Walter lived alone, and no one realized anything was wrong until 4 days later, when his daughter became concerned after several phone calls went unanswered. She contacted apartment management and requested a welfare check. A maintenance worker unlocked the apartment with a master key while responding officers waited nearby. Walter was found on the living room floor beside the overturned popcorn bowl. Investigators reviewed his phone records and the emergency call logs to reconstruct the timeline of his final moments. An autopsy revealed that an unpopped popcorn kernel remained lodged in his airway, confirming that it had completely obstructed his airway. The medical examiner ruled the death accidental. The report explained that this type of blockage is uncommon because most choking victims can still move a small amount of air and cough forcefully. In Walter's case, the kernel caused a complete airway obstruction almost immediately. His daughter later said she never imagined that a few unanswered phone calls would lead to such a heartbreaking discovery. A simple tradition meant to honor his wife ended with a tragedy no one could have predicted.